Welcome to my story time by mybooksummary.com. Get ready for quick wisdom of countless stories and explore. The 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763. It's the mid-18th century, and the world is a giant chessboard. Kings, queens, and emperors are moving their pawns, armies, across continents, trying to outsmart each other. But this isn't just any game. It's the 7 Years' War, a conflict so sprawling it makes your average family Thanksgiving argument look like a polite tea party. From the forests of North America to the plains of Europe, from the coasts of Africa to the shores of India, this war had it all: drama, betrayal, and enough geopolitical tension to fuel 1,000 history textbooks. And yet, despite its global scale, the 7 Years' War often gets overshadowed by flashier conflicts like World War II. But don't be fooled. This was the original World War, and it changed the course of history in ways we're still feeling today. So, grab a cup of coffee, or tea if you're feeling British, and let's dive into the messy, fascinating, and often absurd story of the 7 Years' War. By the end, you'll understand why this conflict wasn't just a war. It was a turning point for empires, economies, and the very idea of global power. Chapter 1: The Players. A cast of characters straight out of a soap opera. Every good story needs a cast of characters, and the 7 Years' War had a doozy. On one side, you had the usual suspects: Britain, Prussia, and their buddies. On the other, France, Austria, Russia, and their gang. And let's not forget Spain and Sweden, who popped in like uninvited guests at a party. At the heart of it all was Frederick the Great of Prussia, a man who was equal parts military genius and eccentric oddball. Imagine a guy who wrote poetry, played the flute, and then went out to conquer half of Europe. That's Frederick. He was the kind of leader who could inspire his troops with a rousing speech and then spend the evening debating philosophy with Voltaire. Then there was Britain, the rising star of the 18th century. Led by the ever-pragmatic William Pitt the Elder, Britain was less about land grabs in Europe and more about building its empire overseas. Think of them as the kid in the group project who does all the work while everyone else argues. France, on the other hand, was the glamorous but slightly past its prime empire. They had style, they had culture, but they were also deeply in debt and spread way too thin. Austria, led by Empress Maria Theresa, was out for revenge after losing territory to Prussia in an earlier war. And Russia? Well, they were just there to stir the pot, as usual. Chapter 2: The Spark. How a diplomatic game of telephone started a world war. You know how a small misunderstanding can blow up into a full-blown argument? That's basically what happened here. The war officially began in 1756, but tensions had been simmering for years. The main issue was control of Silesia, a region that Prussia had snatched from Austria in the War of the Austrian Succession. Maria Theresa was not about to let that slide, so she started forming alliances faster than a high school clique. Meanwhile, Britain and France were already at each other's throats over colonies in North America and India. It was like two neighbors arguing over who owns the fence, except the fence was an entire continent. The tipping point came when Austria and France, longtime enemies, decided to team up against Prussia. This was the diplomatic equivalent of your mom and your arch-nemesis becoming best friends. Frederick the Great, feeling surrounded, decided to strike first. And just like that, the powder keg exploded. Chapter 3: The Battlefields. From the wilderness to the winter palaces. The 7 Years' War wasn't fought in just one place, it was fought everywhere. In Europe, it was a classic slugfest between armies. Prussia, despite being outnumbered, pulled off some stunning victories thanks to Frederick's brilliant tactics. But it wasn't all glory and triumph. The war was brutal, with entire towns destroyed and civilians caught in the crossfire. In North America, the conflict was known as the French and Indian War. Here, British and French forces, along with their Native American allies, clashed in the dense forests and rugged terrain. It was a far cry from the orderly battlefields of Europe, with ambushes, guerrilla tactics, and plenty of mud. Meanwhile, in India, the British and French East India Companies were duking it out for control of trade routes and territories. This was less about national pride and more about cold, hard cash. And let's not forget the Caribbean, where both sides fought over sugar islands like they were the last slices of cake at a birthday party. Chapter 4. The Turning Points, when the tide began to turn. By the late 1750s, the war was starting to take its toll. Prussia was running out of men and money, and Frederick was on the brink of collapse. But then, in a twist straight out of a Hollywood movie, Russia suddenly pulled out of the war after their empress died, and her successor decided he liked Frederick after all. It was like the cavalry arriving just in the nick of time. Meanwhile, Britain was hitting its stride. With victories in North America and India, they were well on their way to becoming the dominant global power. France, on the other hand, was struggling. Their navy was in shambles, their colonies were falling like dominoes, and their treasury was emptier than a college student's bank account. Chapter 5. The Aftermath, a New World Order. When the dust finally settled in 1763, the world looked very different. Britain emerged as the big winner, with a massive empire that stretched from Canada to India. France, on the other hand, was left licking its wounds. They lost most of their colonies in North America and saw their influence in Europe severely diminished. Prussia, despite being battered and bruised, managed to hold onto Silesia and solidify its status as a major power. Austria, meanwhile, had to accept that they weren't going to get their revenge anytime soon. But the war's impact went beyond just shifting borders. It set the stage for future conflicts, including the American Revolution. Britain's victory came at a cost. They were deeply in debt, and their attempts to tax the American colonies would eventually backfire in a big way. Final thoughts. The war that shaped the modern world. The 7 Years' War might not have the name recognition of other conflicts, but its legacy is undeniable. It was the first truly global war, fought on multiple continents and involving nearly every major power of the time. It reshaped empires, redrew maps, and set the stage for the modern world. But more than that, it's a reminder of how interconnected our world has always been. A dispute over a small region in Europe could ripple across the globe, affecting people thousands of miles away. It's a lesson we'd do well to remember today, in an era where conflicts in one part of the world can have far-reaching consequences. So, the next time you hear about the 7 Years' War, don't just think of it as a dusty old chapter in a history book. Think of it as a sprawling, messy, and utterly human story, one that's equal parts tragedy, comedy, and cautionary tale. And who knows? Maybe it'll inspire you to keep your own family feuds a little more low-key. Stay tuned for more enlightening content. Head over to www.mybooksummery.com. Don't forget to subscribe and share the magic with friends, and let's grow together through the power of books and interesting stories.